Welcome to Woodworks. Today I'm going to be building a large curvy desk out of white oak.
Alright, so this is a cool project where I'm going to be using some bent lamination. So the first thing I wanted to do was make some forms for the aprons of the desk. The inner and outer apron have a different radius, so I had to make two separate forms, and here I'm just using some scrap MDF, gluing that together. This is just leftover from another project, and I can shoot a bunch of nails in that to hold it together. Here I'm using a new piece of plywood for the larger form. This was kind of what I had to do here. Just cutting that out with a track saw and then moving to a circle cutting jig to cut it out with the router. So here I'm just using a big compass made with a piece of wood and a pencil held in it to mark out exactly the correct radius, and then moving to the router jig and just cutting it out. With the track saw, I can come and sneak up on the end. I have just a little straight piece that goes on the tail end of the desk there. Now I can cut out a bunch of little pieces to make the skeleton of the form. You can see I just made a bunch of ribs here, and then I can glue and nail on the top piece, and that completes my form. And then here I'm just drilling out some holes so I have space for clamps. Once the forms are done, I can move on to milling the material for the actual bent laminations. For bent laminations, you take a bunch of thin strips and bend them over the form, gluing them together. So here I'm just preparing the board before I take it over the table saw and start ripping it into a bunch of thin strips. Once I've jointed that edge, I can rip my pieces to their final width, and I think these were just a little bit over 4 inches wide. Again, my final dimension was 4 inches, so I cut them a little bit over. And for the inside of the bent laminations, I use soft maple. It's a little bit cheaper and a little more pliable, so I figured I would save myself some money and headache. That doesn't affect the integrity of the piece at all. It just means that you're not wasting some of the more premium wood on the inside where it will never be seen. And all of that maple is entirely covered up by the white oak. So after resawing all those pieces to a little over 1/8 inch on the table saw, I can run them through the planer to get them all to a uniform thickness. So here I use Total Boat epoxy to glue it together. It has a really large open time, which was nice because there's so many laminations, and I think there were 10 total when I was all done, or maybe 12 actually. And it dries really hard, so there's very little spring back once you pull it out of the form. The biggest downside is you have to let each piece sit in the form for 3 days minimum is what I left them, and I think some of them I left them in for even more than that. And after using nearly every clamp in my shop, I can move on to making the top. For the top, I made a big ray pattern where I cut large segments out of each board. Instead of having the grain run straight across the entire top, I had it run around the entire top. You'll see what I mean as this gets built. And after letting those sit, I can take the aprons out of the forms. Now, milling up the pieces for the top went pretty smoothly, and then I just ran them all through my planer to get them to an even thickness, and then back to the joiner to join a square edge. Once those are all done, I can run them through the table saw so every piece was the same width. And now I made a quick tapering jig by using a piece of plywood, and I just screwed down a couple other pieces of little offcut plywood. This made it so I could just screw the piece down and run it through the table saw. I had to do this with each piece to make the diagonal cut. This worked out great though. Once I got this set up, it was pretty quick and simple. And then once that was done, for every piece I could move the stop. I had to lay everything out so I had it exactly how I wanted it. And then I can mark a straight edge with another board here. And to make sure that I was getting the cut exactly where I wanted, I used a precision square and moved it right to the side of the edge of the plywood. And I could clamp it down and then go back to using these little screw clamps. And with that fastened in place, I can put some little stops in, and then I can run that through the table saw again. And then I'll do that with every single piece so that I can ensure every piece has the same angle and is the same width. With those done, I jointed the edge so I had a nice glue surface for each piece. And you can see how that ray is coming together here. Now I used dominoes to join these together to keep this as flat as possible because I didn't want to get off here at all. Just with such a big surface, any little deviation could throw the whole thing off, and that is not what I wanted. So I glued this up in a lot of stages. I glued 2 pieces at a time, and then with each of those sets of 2 pieces, I would glue up that set of 4 rays, and I used all the offcuts in the clamps to act as cauls and to make up the difference in the clamps so the pieces didn't slide out. And as the tabletop got bigger and bigger, this got more and more difficult.
So, while I was planing the boards for the top, on the last pass, on one of the last boards, my planer decided to quit. The feed roller stopped turning, the gears inside of the planer head stripped out, so reluctantly I went out and bought another brand new tool. I will try to fix the other planer still so I can at least keep it as a backup or do something with it.
So with the new planer, I can plane the last of the couple pieces for the top. And this new planer works out great. It's a good addition to the shop, but it was definitely a bummer that the old one broke. I'm still not quite sure what I'm going to do with it. If I'm going to fix it and try to sell it or whatnot. With the last couple pieces, I can start putting the rest of the top together, and you can see how many of the offcuts I was using in the clamps there to make up the difference. This whole desk does about a 90-degree turn, so it really started to get out of hand here. And so what I did was I clamped some offcuts to the desktop itself with double stick tape to really try to keep them from moving. And then I can clamp those together here in the middle to bring the whole piece together. I'm not really sure what other way I would have done this here. And with the top all glued together, I can move on to making the legs. I took a nice piece of 8/4 sawn white oak and ran it through the jointer. Now this is a cool desk. It's going to have 5 legs because of the curved nature of the piece. And this planer is so heavy that to just plane this one piece, I just left it on the ground. This thing weighs nearly 100 pounds. And with those edges milled up, I can cut it through the table saw. And I was lucky enough to just get all 5 pieces out of that one cut. And then with those done, I can move over to taking the last apron piece out of the form. You can see it had a little bit of spring back, but really not too bad. And that was the biggest curve of all 3 of them. Now I can cut the legs to length. I'm just doing that on the table saw. Now to taper these legs, I tried a new technique. I can't remember where I saw this, but you set the joiner to take a really deep cut, and you set a stop to go half of the distance of the taper. Once that is cut, you tip the leg upwards, and it cleans up the entire rest of the piece, creating a taper. I don't know how well I'm explaining that, but if you watch, you should be able to see what I'm doing. And all of the legs get 2 tapers, but the middle leg, I put a taper on all 4 sides to tie it together. Now I can go back to the top, cutting that out with the router again. It's just a really large circle jig. This seemed like the best way to get that arc pattern. And I love circle jigs because there's not much you can screw up with them. You get a really perfect arc, and it comes out really clean. Same thing on the inside here. You can see where I'm stopping. That's that last little straight part, and I could cut the rest of that with the track saw. Now I'm using the domino on the legs to hold them to the aprons. Again, this felt like the best method here just because all those legs had those bent laminations. I really didn't want to screw any of that up. And so I used 2 pretty sizable dominoes on each leg into each apron. And so I did this glue up in a couple pieces. Now cleaning up the actual aprons, and running these through the joiner was quite the challenge, but it was kind of fun to curve the piece around and still be able to joint it. With that done, I can use the table saw to clean up the other side. Again, this was kind of challenging, but kind of neat at the same time, running a big curved piece through the saw. This is just some really fun woodworking. and there must have been a little bit of stuff to clean up there that I used just that little block plane to clean it up before sending it through the table saw again. And here I'm using the miter saw with a support on the end to cut these pieces to their final length. I was pretty nervous to make these cuts because there was so much work into these pieces at this point, so I really didn't want to screw them up. And now I'm using a little batten just to add an extra arc detail. Just drawing this out here and then running this through the bandsaw. Again, this was kind of fun with these big curvy pieces to cut them. Just a little bit different way of woodworking and different way of looking at it, but I love this shot here. It just is pretty cool, I think. And then sanding that edge. Now you can see the exposed bit of maple.
I have all my curves cut. What I want to do now is just put a little half-round bead, quarter-inch half-round bead around the whole piece.
So I'm using my little router table with an 1/8 inch roundover bit.
To get them to bend, I soaked them in the bathtub for 3 or 4 hours and have since put them in this clamping jig. So after soaking them, I bent them around the same form that I used for the bent lamb. They've been sitting like this for about a day and a half.
So I pulled these pieces off the form and they held their shape pretty well. It was definitely an effort to get them exactly where I wanted them. I had to just put a bunch of clamps on and maneuver the wood to where it wanted to go, but once the glue holds, I'm not worried about that going anywhere. I could glue the same strips on the straight pieces, didn't have to do any fancy curves with those.
So here on this rail I added this piece of trim, and I just want to add a little reveal, just a little round that dives into that. This might have been easier to do by routing a 1/8 inch roundover before I glued this up, but then that probably would have filled with glue, so I'd have had to clean it out anyway. Look on this piece, I already did it. That's kind of the profile we're going for. Just a little reveal that dives into there. It just gives it a little bit of a cleaner look.
So to do this, all I did was take a 1/4 inch chisel that was really sharp and basically just use it as a scraper. And that pulled any excess glue out and was able to give it that reveal that I was looking for. And then I went back just with a little bit of sandpaper. Switching out to a really thin curved blade here, I wanted to cut the drawer front out and keep the grain match all across. So I had to get a little creative with how I made this cut. So I just held the workpiece in place and plunged the blade through and then ran up to my line, or just about, and then came back with a Japanese saw to finish out the cut. And for the cut across the grain, I clamped the block and actually used my multi-tool and just plunged down into the face.
So I'd planned to use the coping saw to cut out the corners, but the blade has this little tang that sticks out to catch it in the mechanism. But unfortunately that is thicker than my kerf, so I can't use the coping saw blade, so I'm resorting to something a little more barbaric, but it should work. I've just grabbed a jigsaw blade and a pair of vice grips, and I don't have to cut much.
I wanted to trim out the drawer front so you wouldn't see the lamination, so I'm cutting out some thin strips here that will just cover the top and bottom, and then do the same thing on the inside of the drawer cutout. And once the glue's dried, I can come back and sand everything flush, and it pretty much just disappeared right back into the apron. So this is actually the bottom of the desk, and I ran a good-sized chamfer around the whole thing. And finally, I could start actually gluing pieces together. I glued up these ends first as a separate unit just to keep this glue up a little more under control. There was so much work into this desk at this moment that I I wanted to make sure the glue up was under control, so with those dried, the next day I could start gluing aprons on. It was just a lot of pieces to glue up all at once and had to clamp a lot of weird angles, but I did get it all done. It was a little bit stressful because there was so much time into these pieces, and I really didn't want to mess anything up, but thankfully it all went pretty smoothly. And with the whole piece glued, I can start making the drawer supports, and this adds just a little bit of strength to the whole desk as well. So this I used some pocket hole joinery, which is more than sufficient for what this is. Just needs to hold a drawer up. I clamped all these blocks in place just to keep the desk frame exactly where I wanted it as I screwed the drawer support in, and that actually worked really well. And I can finally move on to the actual drawer itself. This is the drawer front that I cut out, and just gluing those couple other strips onto the drawer front as well. And I can cut the sides out. I made the whole drawer out of maple. Cutting the joinery in this drawer front was a little tricky, so I just kind of used some blocks and my miter gauge to cut out the edge and chiseled everything in place. And then I just cut some rabbets in the sides just to accept the back. And then with the dado stack set up, I could run just some dados for the bottom. And the bottom I just cut out of a 1/2-inch piece of plywood. And I used the front of the drawer to trace that same shape, which I then just cut out on the bandsaw. And to make the drawer bottom flush with the bottom of the rest of the drawer, I used a rabbeting bit in the router. This let it slip right into that groove, and with that all done, I can actually glue the drawer together. This glue up was pretty straightforward, just like gluing most other drawers. Nothing too crazy, but I got it all together, and then could move on to actually making a drawer pull. For the drawer pull, I used this small piece of cocobolo, and I just cut out a little handle on the bandsaw. And with that, I can do a little bit of refining on the disc sander just to give it a nice fit and finish, because it is the one part you're going to be touching the most. And I can glue that on. To hold the top to the base, I'll just use wooden clips, and I like to make these just because I like to make stuff. You can buy metal ones, but I just think the wooden ones are a little bit nicer. And then those all just get drilled out so a screw can fit in there. And then I use the domino. You could also use a biscuit joiner to make the grooves that those will fit into. Now that the whole thing is made, I can move on to finish. I just sprayed lacquer on this piece. I wanted to use something nice and durable because this is going into my local community center and will hopefully be loved and used over many years. And I can finish off with a little bit of wax, and then I can attach the top with those clips that I showed just a minute ago. So here you can see how those get installed in the slots that I cut with the domino. That tongue on the clip just sits right in there, and then they get screwed down. Basically those hold the top to the frame, and they allow for a little bit of wood movement, especially with this top being so big. It's certainly going to see a little bit of seasonal movement, so these clips allow for all of that. And with that, the desk was complete. This was one of my favorite projects that I've ever made, and I'm really happy with how it came out. It was really challenging in a lot of ways, and I hope you enjoyed the build. And here's a couple pictures of it in its final home. Hopefully it will be there for many, many years. And here's a picture of my brother and I. An awful picture of me, but a great picture of him. And he helped me with the delivery, so I was very grateful for that. Anyways, thanks for watching.